Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the jaw-dropping 1901 U.S. Steel merger. We're going to explore how a single, mind-boggling financial transaction at the dawn of the 20th century didn't just completely reshape American industry, it literally birthed the modern philanthropic foundation as we know it. We're talking about a story of immense wealth, massive societal shifts, and some seriously fiery debates that are still raging today. Let's dive in. $1.4 billion. Just let that number sink in for a second. Back in 1901, the American economy was absolutely exploding in size after the Civil War, and steel production had truly become the ultimate measure of national industrial power. Enter J.P. Morgan. He orchestrated this massive, unprecedented consolidation of the industry, creating a colossal new enterprise out of raw steel producers and finished product manufacturers. The resulting corporate behemoth was capitalized at an astronomical $1.4 billion. It was an absolute financial marvel of the modern world. To really wrap our heads around the sheer absurdity of that wealth, we have to compare it to the U.S. government itself. Think about this. In 1901, the entire federal revenue was only $587 million. The whole national debt, just $1.2 billion. Yet, this single, newly formed private company was capitalized at $1.4 billion. This private consolidation of wealth was so unbelievably huge, it effectively dwarfed the financial footprint of the American state itself. This was Andrew Carnegie's brand new reality, and it all happened thanks to a strategic game of golf. Charles Schwab deliberately let Carnegie win to put him in a good mood, and the very next day, Carnegie agreed to sell his steel empire for $480 million. When J.P. Morgan accepted the deal, he famously shook Carnegie's hand and uttered those legendary words, "the richest man in the world." Carnegie walked away with a fortune that translates to tens of billions in today's money. But that immediately raised a huge question. What exactly does one man do with a pile of money that large? Which brings us to part one, inventing modern philanthropy, and how a steel titan evolved into a foundation pioneer. Now, this shift wasn't some overnight change. Carnegie's monumental 1901 buyout really paved the way for institutional trusts, kicking off the modern era of philanthropy around 1911 and directly inspiring John D. Rockefeller soon after. Before this era, charitable giving in America was mostly about wealthy individuals handing out alms to the poor or funding immediate localized relief efforts, kind of like putting a Band-Aid on a problem. But Carnegie, and subsequently Rockefeller, envisioned something completely different. They established perpetual trusts, designed not just to treat the symptoms of poverty, but to actually attack the root causes of social ills through systematic, long-term funding, a total game changer. And, this actually taps into a much older American tradition. Way back in 1835, Alexis de Tocqueville famously observed that Americans had this radical tendency to organize themselves to solve problems voluntarily, rather than just sitting around waiting for the government to do it. The creation of these massive, private, philanthropic foundations at the dawn of the 20th century was essentially the ultimate supercharged evolution of that distinctly American cultural trait. Carnegie really leaned into this spirit with a massive and honestly pretty subversive campaign to build over 2,500 libraries. Why libraries? Well, because at the time, books and formalized education were heavily gated by class and wealth. By blanketing the country and eventually the world with free public libraries, Carnegie completely bypassed traditional power structures. He made self-education freely available to anyone who wanted it. It was a prime example of how private foundation money could step outside the state to rapidly engineer sweeping social change. Moving right along to part two, funding big ideas and the massive ripple effect of all this foundation wealth. When you look at American society today, the fingerprints of foundation money are literally everywhere. You might not even realize it, but the educational testing service that created the SATs, that was funded by foundation money seeking to measure academic merit independently of a student's social background. The initial research for the Head Start program, foundation funded. The children's television workshop that gave us Sesame Street, and even the public broadcasting system that aired it, all sparked by foundation initiatives. Even the modern concept of the middle school, spanning grades 5 through 8, was pushed into the mainstream by foundation-backed educational research. But it goes way deeper than public TV and school grades. This immense societal power extended to the highest courts in the land. Back in the 1940s, foundation money funded Gunnar Myrdal's incredibly powerful study on racial discrimination, called An American Dilemma. And this wasn't just some book that gathered dust on a shelf. The ideas from that research were cited in legal challenges that went all the way to the Supreme Court, directly influencing the landmark 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision. It perfectly demonstrates how private foundation funds can generate ideas that ultimately rewrite the laws of the land. Okay, but with all that influence, it's not all sunshine. Let's look at part 3, the critics from both the left and the right, and the sheer controversy of private wealth. With this kind of immense, unchecked power comes immense scrutiny, and foundations catch heavy fire from both sides of the political aisle. On the left, critics argue that foundations basically allow the ultra-wealthy to park their money tax-free, diverting funds that should rightfully be redistributed by a democratically elected government. From their perspective, it's an unelected elite dictating social spending. Conversely, the right-wing critique argues that this massive wealth was generated by the free market, but the foundations often turn around and use that very wealth to fund liberal advocacy and agendas that undermine free market institutions. So both sides are fundamentally questioning the democratic legitimacy of this massive, independent third sector. Despite these intense critiques, foundation leaders maintain a very different view. They argue that their financial independence uniquely allows them to test new ideas as dedicated stewards of the public good. Think about it. Because they don't have to worry about winning the next election cycle like a politician or stressing over the next quarterly earnings report like a CEO, foundations argue they are perfectly positioned to act as society's experimental laboratory. They can take huge risks on ambitious, long-term projects that the state and the market simply cannot or will not touch. So what does this actually look like on the ground right now? Let's dive into part 4, Philanthropy in Action Today, specifically looking at literacy coaching in schools. To see how foundation money works in practice today, let's look at the concept of literacy coaching. Research shows that as students transition into middle and high school, the complexity of their textbooks spikes dramatically. A lot of kids who read perfectly fine in elementary school suddenly hit a massive wall. To fix this, foundations are heavily funding literacy coaches. Now, these aren't tutors for the kids. They are specialized experts who provide ongoing professional development for the teachers themselves. They ensure that a science or history teacher also knows exactly how to teach the complex reading comprehension required for their specific subject. This usually happens through something called the collaborative coaching and learning model, which is a very hands-on teacher-to-teacher approach. First, the coach and teacher have a pre-conference meeting. Then they actually demonstrate techniques while the kids are right there in the classroom. They practice these in a lab site environment, and finally, they hold detailed debriefings and follow-ups. It's an incredibly granular, highly involved process designed to build instructional capacity from within the school itself, entirely supported and accelerated by philanthropic grants. And this sector is only getting bigger. Get this, today there are roughly 65,000 grant-making foundations operating in the U.S., and with an estimated $40 trillion wealth transfer expected over the coming decades, this third sector is primed to grow massively in power and influence. Plus, the barrier to entry is lowering. You no longer need Carnegie-level wealth to start a family foundation, meaning the sheer number of these independent organizations is absolutely set to explode. As billions and potentially trillions of dollars flow into these private, tax-advantaged trusts over the next few decades, the line between public responsibility and private initiative is going to blur even further. It leaves us with a really critical, provocative question. When it comes to solving our absolute biggest societal challenges, who do we actually trust to lead the way? Is it the state, the free market, or the philanthropists? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer as we navigated the fascinating, complex world of mega philanthropy.